Hello, and welcome to our next unit in biology, cell division or cell reproduction. In this unit, we're going to discuss the different types of cell reproduction, the importance, why it's important that cells can reproduce, and also the different stages that cells go through during their lifetime. All right, so the first question is, cells reproduce, but why? Why in the heck do we need new cells? Well, first of all, the size of your cells is limited. They cannot get very large because you are moving nutrients like water, food like glucose. You're also moving waste out of the cell, and you're using diffusion, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, some active transport. It works really well when you have really small cells. But if the cells get too large, the cells will be unable to move enough of these materials in and out of the cell for the cell to survive. So the cell has to remain somewhat small. Number 2, growth. When you get bigger, guess what? You need more cells. Number 3, you probably don't know, but every single day you got to repair or replace damaged or worn out tissue that gets worn out from just daily activities. Cells don't last forever, so you got to replace them. And number 4, reproduction of the organism. Some of them are going to reproduce what's called asexually, and other organisms like ourselves, we're going to reproduce through sexual reproduction, and we'll go over that later. Alright, so just to show you what growth is, obviously, when everybody is born, they look something like this, a little tiny baby, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8 pounds, small little guy. Well, eventually, that small little guy can turn into this big offensive lineman here from the Dallas Cowboys. Well, to go from here to here, obviously, you gotta gain a lot of cells. I mean, this little baby here probably has about the same amount of cells as this guy's arm. So, you need to make new cells in order to grow and develop. Another reason why cells need to reproduce is to replace cells that are injured, damaged, or just worn out. In the time it takes you to look at this slide, you will lose approximately 40,000 skin cells. Just today, during today, you will lose over 50 million skin cells. You're going to lose 50 million skin cells today. What if you weren't able to replace those skin cells that you lose, that fall off? Eventually, you'd go from looking like this to looking like that. Now, if you look like this on October 31st, Halloween, all right, maybe that'd be pretty cool because you got yourself a Halloween costume. But other than Halloween, the other 364 days, you probably don't want to look like that. You want to replace all the cells that you lose so you can remain looking like this. And the other reason why cells need to reproduce is because organisms need to reproduce. That is one of the characteristics of all living things. All living things are able to reproduce. On this top one over here, this is going to be an example of asexual reproduction, where you have a single cell. It makes a copy of its DNA, and then it simply breaks off into 2 exact copies of the original cell. So this original cell over here copies its DNA, and then splits in half into 2 exact copies. That's asexual reproduction. asexual. Reason is that it started with one parent cell and you ended up with two daughter cells. Down here, you have this couple, they're holding hands. Well, I'm not going to tell you what happens after the holding hand stage, but eventually these two, you have two parent organisms, mother and a father, and they can reproduce to make a baby. Now, these two, they form sex cells. Sex cells are called gametes. For the male, the gametes are called sperm. And for the female, the gametes are called the egg or an ovum. And when those two come together at a specific time called fertilization, you can get one of these. All right, so here are the two broad categories of cell reproduction. And we've kind of gone over it already. The first one is asexual. That is the reproduction of cells from a single parent organism. So basically, one cell makes a copy of its DNA and divides to become two identical daughter cells to the original cell. Now, we do not reproduce like that, us humans. We reproduce through sexual reproduction. Through a process that we'll learn later called meiosis, we make gametes or sex cells. And like I said, in the males, that is called sperm. And in the females, that is called the egg or the ovum. And when those two come together during fertilization, you can reproduce and have a baby. All right, so the first type of cell reproduction we're going to talk about is called mitosis. What is it? Well, mitosis, first of all, is asexual. It's an asexual reproduction. That means it does not require two parent organisms in order to reproduce. It can reproduce from a single cell. Now, before that, the chromosomes or the DNA needs to replicate, and the nucleus will then divide. The cell will then pinch off to form two daughter cells with identical genetic information as the original parent cell. Now, where in our body does mitosis take place? Where does it take place? Well, it takes place in our body cells. Another word for body cells is called your somatic cells. If I were you, I would learn somatic cells because I will not use body cells. I'm going to use the term somatic cells. So these are cells like your skin, the cells that line your stomach, your bones, your blood cells, both red and white, etc. These are cells that are going to reproduce through mitosis. When your skin cells need to make more skin cells, you want them to be identical copies of the original. Your skin cells do not have to get together. You don't need male and female skin cells in order to reproduce. They just make an exact copy of themselves in order to reproduce. All right, so some mitosis key terms. First one, cyclins. These are special proteins which help to regulate the cell cycle in eukaryotic cells. Remember, these are the cells that you have in your body, eukaryotic cells. These are cells that have a true nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are things like bacteria, which do not have a true nucleus. But the cyclins are what regulate the cell cycle. Now, I know you don't know that yet, what it is, but there's different phases in the cell cycle, and these proteins help to regulate when the cell goes in and out of these different stages in the cell cycle. The next word is called chromatin. Basically, that is your DNA, which is wrapped around proteins called histones. Well, your DNA, your nucleic acids, wrapped around these proteins called histones, those combine form chromatin. The next term is called chromosomes. Chromosomes is basically your DNA. As a human being, in each one of your cells, as a Homo sapien, you have 46 chromosomes. And they'll look something like this, down here below. Chromatids, very similar to chromosomes. This blue arm of the chromosome and this yellow arm, those are exact copies of each other. So this blue one right here, it made an exact copy of itself. I know it's yellow, but this is an exact copy. These are exactly the same. Each arm on this chromosome, these are called sister chromatids. Now, the crazy thing is, they're attached, well, first of all, they're attached here. These sister chromatids are attached here in the center at a place called the centromere. Now, eventually, these sister chromatids are going to separate from each other. So this yellow guy is going to move this way. The blue guy is going to move that way. And once they separate from each other, they're no longer sister chromatids. Now they're single-stranded chromosomes. So, this whole blue and yellow X is a chromosome. Each little arm is a chromatid. But once they separate from each other, once they release from the centromere, they now become single-stranded chromosomes. Alright, so here's a little diagram of mitosis and basically the importance of DNA replication. So we start out with a very simple cell with only 2 chromosomes. You got a red one and you got a blue one right there. Well, in this stage of the cell cycle, it's very important. You can see that the DNA has been replicated. So there's no longer just one red and one blue. Now we have 2 red sister chromatids. Still only 1 chromosome, but we have 2 chromatids and we have 2 blue chromatids. Well, as we move down the cell cycle, since we replicated our DNA, we are now able to make 2 cells that are exact copies of our original cell over here. If the cells did not replicate their DNA right there, and we started with a simple cell with 1 red chromosome and 1 blue chromosome, and they did not replicate their DNA like this, if they simply just divided without replicating their DNA, we would end up with a cell, 2 cells, one with 1 red chromosome and one with 1 blue chromosome. But that is not what we want in mitosis. We want to make exact copies of the original cell. We do not want to come up with 2 cells that are different from the original cell we started with. Alright, so maybe I should have took out this slide because it basically says the same thing as the last slide. But anyways, it just re-emphasizes why it's important. The synthesis stage of interphase, the S stage of interphase, the middle, where the DNA is replicating. The replication of the DNA. And you can see it down here. This is a single strand of DNA, and it is replicating to make 1, 2 strands of DNA that are exactly the same as the original strand of DNA. And that is important so that when the cell divides, each cell gets all of the DNA as the original parent cell. Alright, this slide is not the great, but phases of mitosis. In case you can't read it, I wanted to read it for you. Alright, so what the heck is this? Dog with going rough. Alright, this dog is standing on a little mat. Looks like grass. And in some places like New York, if you have a dog and you live like on the 30th floor of some apartment building and your dog has to go to the bathroom, you probably don't want in the middle of the night to go down the elevator, take him to find a little spot of grass or a light pole or a fire hydrant or whatever to relieve himself on. It would be nice to have one of these little mats in your apartment so your dog wouldn't have to go outside. Well, the question is, what would you call that mat if you invented it? Well, one thing you could call it, since your dog is going to go pee on the mat, maybe you could call it a pee mat. Why is that important? Because that is going to help you remember the 4 stages of mitosis. The first stage starts with a P. It's called prophase. Second phase starts with an M. It's called metaphase. Third stage starts with an A. It's called anaphase. And the fourth stage starts with a T. It's called telophase. Alright, so before we get to our mitosis, the P-mat, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, we have an I phase. So you can think of IP-mat for the whole cell cycle, and that I stands for interphase. And the interphase is when a cell is not currently dividing. It is just being a cell. And it will look like a cell like this. Now, this pink oval-like structure in the middle, that's called the nucleus. You can see there's a little dark line around that nucleus. That's the nuclear membrane. It is still intact. Also, chromosomes are not visible under a microscope during interphase. I'll use this cell off to the side over here. If it was not an interphase, you would see the chromosomes and they would look like little dark worms or bars like this. You do not see that in that cell. So that cell is an interphase because you cannot see the chromosomes. There are 3 stages of interphase. The first one is called G1 or gap 1. This is when a cell just got done dividing, it is growing, and it's basically performing its normal functions as a cell. Depending on what cell it is, it's doing whatever job it needs to do to keep the organism healthy and alive, including the cells you have. The middle stage, or the second stage of interphase, is called the S stage or the synthesis stage. This is when the cell is replicating or making an exact copy of its DNA/chromosomes in order to divide. When the cell divides, it needs a copy of its chromosomes, its DNA, so when the cell divides, both new cells get all of the DNA as the original cell. The final stage of interphase is called the G2 or gap 2. This is when a cell is preparing to divide by making important organelles. So we know eukaryotic cells contain many organelles, so they may be replicating or making mitochondria or chloroplasts, rough ERs, whatever. It is making new organelles getting ready to divide. Okay, our last slide for today. This is just another cell that is in interphase. You can see the nucleus right here. This is the cell membrane. You can see that the nuclear membrane is still clearly intact. You do not see any dark bars in it. Those would be the chromosomes if they were there, but you cannot see them. It just looks like basically pretty much a solid purple. These little red structures right here, those are called the centrioles. Those will become important later. Don't need to know them yet, but we will go over them later. So you got to be able to understand what a cell looks like in interphase. You do not see the chromosomes. The nuclear membrane is still intact, and you do not see dark chromosomes within the nucleus.